When I think of the feast of St. Simon and Jude, the first one I started to think about was St. Jude. Now, when I think of St. Jude, there's actually two things that come to mind. One is the Shroud of Turin, and the other is the one phrase that he says in the Gospel of John. Those are two things that came to my heart. The phrase that he says in the Gospel of John, there's a moment when they're at the Last Supper, and the disciples are asking different questions, and Jude, it adds, not the Iscariot, asked Jesus. It's a really good question. Why is it you manifest yourself to us, just the ones who are here, like the front pew, why do you manifest yourself to us and not to the whole world? In other words, Jesus, why didn't you walk on water in front of the 5,000? Why didn't you ascend to heaven so that more people would see? Why didn't you do those miracles? Why didn't you do things that were more spectacular in front of people so that they would convert in the moment and just be like this surge, this political wow? Why didn't you do that? Jesus says, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word. And I will love him, and I will come to him and reveal myself to him. Whoever does not love me does not keep my word. And my word is not mine, but the Father who sent me. In other words, Jesus does not, he's God, he can do whatever he wants. He has absolute power, he has the last word, he is the Lord of history. But he doesn't want to be publicly acclaimed as much as he wants to be privately loved. I'm not saying that we shouldn't build churches. I'm not saying that we shouldn't acclaim Jesus in the streets. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have processions where we're praising God publicly. I'm not saying that. But his first priority, the absolute thing that he really wants, that he's shooting for, even if he does exterior things, even if we make beautiful churches, the goal isn't the church. The goal is the interior church of our heart. He wants to be loved by one. He wants to look at you in the eyes and ask you, do you believe me? He doesn't want you to believe him just because you've seen a lot of miracles, but because you trust him. You say, I know that you are good God, and I know that you are God. And I trust everything I have to you. It's interesting, recently I found out that Philip of Macedonia, who was the father of Alexander the Great, that in 1977 they found a tomb in Greece that had an arrow wound under the eye. They're studying also the things that are around the tomb, and they decided, without a doubt, that is the tomb of Philip II of Macedonia. In other words, the father of Alexander the Great. In other words, they decided because of the wound, because they knew from the studies historically that he had died by a wound underneath the eye, that it must have been him, undeniably. So nobody denies it. Funny enough, you've probably heard of the Shroud of Turin, right? It's kind of funny because now when people hear the Shroud of Turin, they often say, oh, the Shroud of Turin, didn't they do those the carbon 14 testing on that? Isn't that like no longer legit? Isn't that what they... And whenever I hear that, I think, are they really doubting the Shroud of Turin? It's interesting. I say the reason I'm mentioning the Shroud of Turin today is because we know historically, by the first historian of the church, Eusebius, that the Shroud of Turin was entrusted to St. Jude. And St. Jude brought it to the king of Edessa and cured the king of Edessa with it. It's kind of funny. It's beautiful because even in this church, after this Mass, we're going to use the glove of Padre Pio, which has also cured people. And we're going to use that because as the church, we believe in relics, that God likes to do things through physical things. A God who becomes flesh likes to touch things. And the relic of the Shroud of Turin, which I'm mentioning because it's united with St. Jude, it's something which is very similar to what we were mentioning right at that beginning, that phrase of St. Jude. Because if someone studies it, if someone looks at it, you might, at first, if you just read the headlines on the newspapers, you'll be like, the Shroud of Turin. Didn't they prove that wrong because of carbon-14 testing? It's true, the carbon-14 testing sent it to Arizona, sent it, I don't know if it was to Zurich, to Oxford. They sent it to several places, but they burned the evidence. And the interesting thing is, they've discovered now, is kind of, because whenever someone says carbon-14, I think they're like way like old school. Like they haven't gone past like 1980s. Because the new studies show that they've actually done Raman FTIR, like they've studied it in different ways, which is a way of, Raman technology is one where you look at it with like a laser and you realize that it's older, way older than just Middle Ages. Another is the mechanical method, which you vibrate it in such a way, it actually has a different name, but just call it the mechanical method. You vibrated it so you can see by the tension of the cloth how old it is. Also shows that it's older than that. Another way that they have is by looking at the vanillin. Vanillin is a substance which does not exist. It's a substance which is in vegetable things that are were alive at one point, but it's a substance which leaves an organism over time. So something which is dead for a long time, like the Dead Sea Scrolls no longer have any vanillin in them. And the Shroud of Turin doesn't either. And they've also seen that the stitch that's on the Shroud of Turin, also, not only did it go through fires, but that stitch itself is a stitch that's only from the 1st century. There's a poor guy who did his doctorate just to study and just to say that one phrase. The reason I say this is because there's an overwhelming evidence, and not only that, it's in the Bible. Like, in the Bible, in John chapter 20, verse 6 and 7, it says how they went into the tomb and they found not only the thing that was covering him, but also the headpiece that was covering him as well. In other words, something was covering his head. We have both of those today. The the Sudario of Oviedo, as it's called, is still venerated in Spain. And they know historically that you find the two paths and they go different sections and they weren't used and there's blood on both of them, they have the same blood type, etc., etc. The reason I say this is because Jesus wants to be, I'm not saying this so you'd be like, oh, okay, now the Shroud of Turin is true, end of story. The reason Jesus gives us these evidences, the reason he gives us these things is so that there can be enough truth to know that he is alive. This brings us to the other saint. You have St. Jude, who I've been mentioning up till now, and you have St. Simon the Zealot. Notice that both these saints are together today, that the Lord wanted to put their feast day together. Jesus doesn't want us just to know that he exists, to be privately found in our hearts. He wants us to become zealous. He wants us to become like Simon, not in the sense of like wanting to hurt somebody, but in the sense of discovering the truth and caring about it. It has to transform our life. It has to be something that when it touches us and we know it's true, not only do we want to give it to others, we want to know Jesus Christ more and more in our hearts. In the book of Sirach, it says, fight for the truth, even till death, and the Lord will fight for you. Amen.